This video will cover a brief introduction of servlets. So, what is a servlet? It is a web component which is present on the server side, and it is nothing but a program which is written in Java. So, a servlet helps to dynamically extend the functionality of a server. So, instead of the server returning some static pages, we are going to return some dynamic pages from the server. So, there will be some processing which is done on the server side, and then the response will be returned to the client. Now, servlets execute on a Java enabled server because servlets are nothing but Java programs. They will require the server to be Java enabled. So, the JDK, the Java Development Toolkit, will be required on the server. And the client may also be a thin client, so there is no need for the client to have a Java enabled browser or to have JDK installed in it, because the client is just going to send requests using the browser or some other tool, and it is just going to get some HTML response in return, which it just has to render and display to the client. So a servlet will take the HTTP request from the client, it will handle it. So handling means it will talk to a database or it will talk to some Java Bean component, and then it will do some processing and then respond with a response, an HTTP response, which is in most of the cases an HTML file. The servlet is also capable of dispatching the request to another servlet. So if the servlet, if we write some code to pass on a request from one servlet to another, then the request will be dispatched to the other servlet, and then the other servlet will accordingly handle the request and then respond. So we may dispatch a request to another servlet or another JSP and so on. So this servlet will provide us a framework. Servlets API provides a framework for creating applications, web applications that implement this request response paradigm. Now, as we saw, what can servlets do? So they can dynamically build and return HTML files. So dynamic files means that uh, the files will have some variables which may change depending on the user input. So we do not return the same content every time. So let's say, like, if we are returning the time, the current time on our web page, so it is always going to change or it may always update. So we can set some variables like these which will change. So depend, also we may give some user specific information on in the response. So these pages are called dynamic pages, and servlets can dynamically build these pages and return these. Servlets can also process user input which is being passed from the HTML form. So when the client is sending a request, he may enter some data in the HTML form which is being passed to the server using a get or post method, and then the servlet can process that input. Also, for example, like if we are passing the username and the password, so the servlet can also authenticate the user by matching the username and password with the database and so on. The servlet can interact with server resources like databases, network files, printers, and all. Also, the servlets can forward requests from one server to another server as well. So that is called load balancing. And also servlets can manage state. So as we saw, we are using HTTP protocol for the request response paradigm, and HTTP is a stateless protocol. So stateless means that HTTP will not remember who the client is. So HTTP will not remember the data that you had sent earlier, or it will not remember that the who is the currently logged in user. So that is why we will need to programmatically store the state, and servlets are capable of managing state. So there are many mechanisms like cookies and all, so we can use them to manage the state of our application. Now, why servlets? So servlets are efficient because they reduce the time required for creating new processes. as compared to CGI. So CGI handles each request using a process, whereas in servlets, each new request is handled by a lightweight thread. So to handle a new request, a thread is created and that thread handles that request. So that is why the process is faster and there is a reduction in the memory requirement as well. So this is the first point. So that servlets are efficient. Then using servlets is also convenient because the in the servlets API there are classes and interfaces provided which implement the request response paradigm. So all functionality is provided and we just have to build our application using the servlets API. So we just have to use their framework to build our application. So that is why it is very convenient for the programmer as well. Also, because servlets are just Java programs, so they can run on multiple platforms and they are write once, run anywhere. So we can write them once and we can port our code to any machine. So that is why servlets are portable. Also, since servlets are written in Java and Java has exception handling capability, so that is why we can use try catch blocks easily in our Java code to catch any exceptions that might occur. Also, using servlets, we can achieve functionality like session tracking, database connectivity using JDBC, and we can also integrate with other Java frameworks. Next, we'll see the basic structure of a servlet. So this is a class skeleton servlet. So you have to create a class with your servlet name and you have to extend HTTP servlet. And these are the three methods: init, service, and destroy. The return type for all these methods is void. So in the init method, we write the initialization code. In the service method, we write the actual logic that we want to be executed when the servlet is called. And in the destroy method, we write some destruction code like freeing the resources. So the init method, it is called only once when the servlet is loaded. So whenever the servlet is loaded for the first time, the init method is called and all variables are initialized using the init method. Next, the service method. So the service method is automatically called by the server whenever it receives a client request. So depending on the type of request received from the client, it will accordingly call a service method. So there can be multiple service methods in a servlet, and depending on what the request is, that corresponding service method can be executed. Now, this method has to be overridden if we want to provide some custom functionality. So we will see in our code how we can override the service method and how we can write our own code in the service method. Next is the destroy method. So it is executed whenever the servlet is unloaded, and all the resources which are occupied by the servlet, all those resources are freed. So this happens only once. So the init method and destroy method are only called once, and the service method might be called multiple times. Now the basic servlet structure. So you do not need to implement the init method and the destroy method. So init and destroy are already implemented in the parent class. That is why we do not need to implement it. We can only implement it if we want to give some custom functionality. But in most of the cases, there will not be a need to override these functions. And the servlet may implement another method instead of the service method. So depending upon the type of HTTP request that we are trying to handle, we may override some method other than the service method. So it is just a service method, but it has a specific name. Like if we are dealing with a get request, then we will have a method named do get. If we are dealing with a post request, then we have a method named do post. So we can implement these do get, do post methods if we know that we are dealing with a get request or a post request. Now, in the basic servlet structure, there are two things which are common for each servlet. So, one is that all of them extend either the generic servlet class or the HTTP servlet class. And all servlets override at least one method wherein custom functionality is implemented. So, each servlet will have to override one method, so that is our service method. So it can be do get or it can be do post. So it should have at least one method wherein we are defining the custom functionality of our servlet.